TIF, so tax increment financing, is what sounds like a pretty good program. A city may have a part of town that is economically disadvantaged. It is resistant to people investing, and it has been that way. You immediately think of parts of town that fit this description. Maybe there's a shopping mall that hasn't been used in a number of years. There are weeds coming up through the asphalt. And so a developer says, like we all do, if this isn't worth the risk of putting my money into it, I won't see a return. And that's a fair conclusion for them to make. But the city has an interest in developing this part of land. So what they say is, look, we will reduce the risk by returning to you the increase in property taxes that results from your investment. So we all understand if we add a room to our house or a garage, the county comes along and says, that's a really good improvement you did on your property, and we're going to charge you more in taxes. And that increase in taxes is enough of a risk, of a disincentive to invest that a lot of businesses just don't touch it. So again, the city says, look, we'll freeze the property tax rate where it is, and as your assessment grows, we'll give that back to you. We'll collect it and give it back to you to offset the cost of your investment. So again, it sounds pretty good, right? Here's government kind of saying, we understand that taxes are too high. And if we reduce taxes, we can spur development. That's the crazy thing about Kansas City and St. Louis government, is that they are ostensibly left-leaning big government, but their economic development corporations have baked into their premise, taxes are too high, and if we reduce taxes, we can spur investment. The problem is, thanks to statutory language in Missouri and frankly in states all around the country, the barriers to getting TIF, the things that you have to demonstrate in order to qualify to get your money back, are meaningless. And so what's happened in Kansas City and St. Louis is more and more businesses are doing it. Frankly, they'd be foolish not to because it's so easy to get. And the city is slowly losing funds that would otherwise go to schools, libraries, basic services. So I went over this. So another thing that we won't talk about it too much here is, so the city will say, we'll give you back 100% of your property taxes over the initial amount, and 50% of the sales tax or the earnings tax or the utilities taxes. And basically what they're doing is they're saying the property tax, which goes to those guys, we'll let you keep all of, but the economic activity taxes, which comes to us, well, we'll let you keep half of that. So they're basically giving away other people's money, and they're pretty generous with it. So oftentimes school districts and libraries, who have the most at stake at TIF, have only maybe 1 or 2 out of 11 votes on TIF commissions around the state. Super TIF allows, Kansas City has done a lot of this, I don't know that St. Louis have, but Super TIF allows the city to give away 100% of its own income from the property. And here's kind of a visual. So imagine this is a timeline. You've got that vacant shopping center I talked about. It's sitting there. Maybe it's paying, or whoever owns it is paying a tiny amount of property tax on it. And the development increases the value over time, but this money, this increment, is returned to the developer. And then the theory is that at the end of 23 years, the taxing jurisdictions will keep that new money, right, and everybody will be happy. The investor will have gotten their subsidy, and the schools and libraries will be made whole. And again, this is Jackson County, but I'm sure it's similar here. 62% of your property tax dollars goes to the local school district. So again, they have the most at stake here. 20% goes to the city. The rest is county library, and again, I'm sure it's similar throughout the state. And then just to give you an idea of perspective, Good Jobs First, which is kind of a it's a left-leaning pro-labor union organization, has looked at TIF around the country and has got some pretty shocking numbers about what Missourians have invested in this program. $6 billion we have are the total value of our subsidies, about $1,000 per capita. And we are 10th in total dollar value in the country. It puts us ahead of some pretty big spenders. Missouri, again, I argue, because our statutory language on TIF is so broad that developers show up and get all sorts of benefits. Some of the bigger recipients are Cerner, which is based in Kansas City, and H&R Block. I'll take talk more about them in a bit, and DST, which is also based in Kansas City. What we found in our research, by the way, is that I think since 2002, there are about 38 TIF projects have been introduced in Kansas City, about 70 in St. Louis. St. Louis tends to have smaller TIF projects, whereas Kansas City's are fewer, but they're larger. Springfield, for example, has 3 TIF projects. Columbia has 3. So St. Louis and Kansas City have really run away with this, but it's becoming more popular down in the Ozarks and Columbia. I think developers have realized this is a good thing. So that's, if you want to learn more about the rest of this, this is a video from my talk about 1.5 years ago. There are shockingly only 51 views. I can't imagine why that's the case. I was a dynamic speaker, I was charming, but I encourage you to go if you have a free hour or you want to torture somebody, you can go back and listen to me talk more about that. So the important part is that TIF doesn't work. And this isn't just the Show Me Institute saying. I'll give you some examples. This is the Power and Light District in Kansas City. And I went to Louisville. Louisville has a Power and Light District. Baltimore has the Power Station near where I grew up. And this is Cordish or other firms that kind of go around the country and build these almost cookie cutter entertainment districts. So they'll have lots of restaurants, lots of bars. They have a common area where bands might come in and play. And Kansas City, up until maybe 12 years ago, had a pretty moribund downtown. It was just warehouses, and it was an eyesore, I'll admit. And so around 2006, the city finally realized the opportunity they had with TIF and began subsidizing a great deal of development, including the Power and Light District and H&R Block's headquarters. And there, you see all these Gordon Biersch, Chipotle. There are all sorts of restaurants that you recognize from around the country down there. There's an awful lot of economic activity down in the Power and Light District. And so politicians and pundits and developers point to this and say, look, this wasn't here before. You gave us TIF and now it's here, which is a very compelling argument to make, but it is a basic logical fallacy because they don't say it. But what they want you to believe is because TIF happened before the development, TIF caused the development. And the research just says that is not true at all. And here's an example. So one of the things that Kansas City does, I don't know that St. Louis does it, but we require everybody who works in a restaurant to have a health card. It's about $65. It lasts for 3 years. They do a background check. Maybe they ask you some questions about where the spoons go. I don't know. But you have to have that card. And of course, they also keep records of liquor licenses for bars and restaurants. So I went and asked them how many of those health cards and liquor cards had they issued every year for the past 15 years or so. And this is the point. This is when the Power and Light District opens in 2007, and the numbers have been flat. So yes, you can look at the Power and Light District and say, in this part of town, there are a lot more restaurants and bars, and there's a lot of economic activity. But citywide, the numbers are flat. All we've done is move economic activity from around the city to one particular place. And the research tells us around the country that's what TIF does at best. Maybe you can incentivize a company to move its development a few miles or a few blocks away, but you cannot get a smart company to do something it wouldn't otherwise do. And what you'll see later on is that oftentimes TIF and economic development subsidies simply pay a company to do what it was going to do anyway. So this is the H&R Block headquarters. In 2015, H&R Block reported to the Department of Revenue through their TIF report that their downtown building, and here it is, it's right in the Power and Light District, it's beautiful, that they had 2,200 new jobs. Now, the Department of Revenue doesn't define what a new job is, and they don't count any new jobs. They depend upon the recipient of TIF to report those numbers. And when I asked a woman over the email, how do you get to these numbers? She said they are self-defined and self-reported. We don't audit this at all. So I went back and looked, and I found on the website of the architectural firm that built this building, they had on kind of a glitzy splash page, hey, we helped build this building in 2006, and 1,600 H&R Block employees moved in. They moved in. H&R Block had satellite offices all over the metro area. We subsidized a giant glass building. They moved those employees into their giant glass building, and H&R Block claimed those as new jobs. Now, maybe they were new jobs in that building, but they were not at all new jobs in any meaningful way. Yet if you look at the TIF report, you will say, hey, we've created 2,200 new jobs, and I'm telling you, it is meaningless. The subsidies covered 95% of the cost of the H&R Block building, and I am told they rent out part of it, that they've never occupied the full building. H&R Block has had some trouble since 2006, and some people will say to me, well, Patrick, it's very difficult to predict economic growth in certain sectors. How are we to know that H&R Block would take a hit? And I said, that's exactly right. You are gambling with public dollars, and you don't know what the future will bring, so stop it. Stop it. Pay for the police, pay for the roads. Stop paying for H&R Block's, as Brenda calls it, corporate pleasure dome. So here are the other studies on TIF. The East-West Gateway here in Kansas City did a study in 2011 which said we're not getting an adequate return on this. We're paying $370,000 per job based on recent investment. In 2013, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill looked at TIF and said, this paper shows that TIF fails the but-for test. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Well, I'll talk about it now. So the two things you need to do to get a TIF are demonstrate blight, and you all immediately have a picture in your head of what blight looks like. It's a burnt-out building, it's that shopping center. And the other thing you have to demonstrate is that without the subsidy, this investment wouldn't happen, right? That's called the but-for. But for the subsidy, this wouldn't happen. And the statutory language around those two terms are frustrating because oftentimes the only evidence you require to demonstrate but-for is an affidavit from the developer saying, I won't do this without the subsidy. That's it. They are giving evidence in their own hearing. And that is really frustrating. And oftentimes it's even worse. They will say, yes, there will be a positive return on this investment without a subsidy. But with the subsidy, our return will go up. And we really want a higher return. Branson, thank goodness, their board of aldermen just turned down a water park, building this huge water park. It was immediately going to be, according to the developer, the country's 6th largest. And they said, without the subsidy, we'll get about 10% and change return. But the standard return on these types of projects is 11 to 18. So we want a TIF to move our profit margin into about 14%. So this wasn't helping a project become profitable. It was helping a profitable project become even more profitable. And let me tell you, the Branson School District can't afford to part with any funds. So I think what happened was not only the money didn't make sense to the council, but so many small businesses, family-run businesses in Branson said, we don't want to subsidize through our property taxes the competition. And so they turned it down. But again, sometimes it's simply making a profitable investment more profitable. The St. Louis, this is shocking, the St. Louis Development Corporation conducted their own study and said it's clear the city gains no net benefit from an extremely costly program with no real economic development impact. What I have to make clear to people around the state is the St. Louis Development Corporation administers TIF. These are the guys that actually give away the dollars, and they have said themselves there's no return on the investment. And in fact, I understand, I don't know that we did it, but I understand that report had to be, someone had to file a sunshine request to get a copy of that report. I think when the SLDC got the results, they weren't too happy with them. So we hired the gentleman from the from UNC Chapel Hill to do a study of all of Missouri, and he found specific to us that the TIF has not diverted investment or increased economic activity. What he found is that if you look at the areas that have TIF and the areas that don't have TIF, they grow at the same rate. They grow at the same rate. You can't say that TIF is contributing to any economic growth. And these two are the most interesting to me. So the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research came out in 2017 and said, and this is kind of a left of center group, and what they basically said, maybe similar to Good Jobs First, is they said, hey, we're giving out these corporate subsidies, and the jobs they create aren't high paying and don't have a great deal of benefit. Why are we subsidizing, kind of the archetypal, cold businessman? If we're going to be using tax subsidies, we might as well get a return. And they said, it sacrifices long-term tax base without creating good jobs. And then this is a white paper they're working on right now, At least 75% of incented firms would have done this development anyway without the incentive. That is shocking. But because the standards are so low, again, they know they'd be foolish not to go to the city and ask for subsidies. And sometimes the situation under which they go is embarrassing. The developer already owns the land they want to build, right? They're already doing this. In some cases, the project has already begun construction, and they go and ask for money. And again, it's hard to argue with that. If you're a private investor or you're a developer, your job is to get the best deal possible, and if some fool city will cut your taxes to do so, I can't blame you for getting that deal. I wish cities gave it out less. In fact, there's a number of restaurants being built in my south of the Ward Parkway shopping center in my neighborhood, and I read in the Star that they weren't accepting any TIF, which is noteworthy, because in Kansas City, a developer building and not getting subsidies is worthy of the press. If they're building and getting subsidies, that doesn't warrant mention. So I called them and I said, "You're not getting subsidies." And they said, "Well, we don't think it's blighted." And I said, that doesn't matter, right? And he said, "Yes, we deal with subsidies in Kansas. We know how this works. We just didn't want to do it." And then it wasn't a year, it was a year before they broke ground, and I was afraid that I had tipped them off and I was going to read in the paper about how they had applied for TIF. We got an anonymous call and said this was a good idea. But they built 6 restaurants. They're thriving. The businesses can build without subsidies. That's what I have to explain to people, and you'll see one gentleman in a minute who doesn't think that's true. Oh, here he is. So this is Steve Rose. He's a columnist, editorial writer for the Kansas City Star. And this is him telling me on Ruckus, which is our version of Donnybrook, that I don't care what the research tells you, because Steve Rose saw a field, and then he saw subsidies, and now he sees a building. So he says, well, subsidies put the building there. And I said to him, "Steve, that's not what the research said." And he barked, "I don't care what the research tells you." And myself and Crosby Kemper never miss an opportunity to remind him of saying that. But it is a powerful device, right? You drive. We all do this. We drive by a shopping center that's been moribund for years. We see some development, we're like, oh, something's happening. And if we read later in the paper that they got subsidies, in our head, they're like, okay, government's doing something. Kansas City issued their own study on economic development subsidies, which is awful. They hired a trade association to do it. So in St. Louis, you guys hired PFM to do it. They did a great job. They had a legitimate methodology and went about looking at the numbers. CDFA is a trade association of municipal financiers. We hired them to look at our municipal development financing, and they said, you guys are doing a great job. But all they did was look at the subsidy given and the resulting project, and did a division and found for every $1 of subsidy, you get $3.83 in return. And even the city council was like, this is awful. Like when they reported, they're like, how do we this report can't be used to help us make better decisions in the future. But again, this is the state of what's going on in Missouri, that the academic studies are saying it's not any good. So our question is, if we know it doesn't work, why are we still doing it? And there was a story in The Pitch years back. Steve Baccarat now works for the Star. He's a great reporter, and he's a great reporter on this topic. And he wrote about Burns & McDonnell. We'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. Burns & McDonnell is the world's 18th largest engineering firm. Its world headquarters is in Kansas City, the southern part of town. And for a while, the plot next to them was Beth Shalom, a Jewish synagogue and school. Now the congregation moved into Kansas, and the temple sat unoccupied for a number of years. Their developer, Van Tuyl, bought the land and sat on it for a few years, and then according to The Pitch, Burns & McDonnell held a fundraiser for the mayor at their existing headquarters. 263 people gave the mayor money. Most of them live in Kansas, not in Missouri, and most of them, I'm told, don't even make political contributions in Kansas. But the mayor came, he raised about $41,000. Then he subsequently said, I think we should support Burns & Mac's request for subsidies. Burns & Mac hadn't even made a request for subsidies yet. Their TIF application came later. But they bought Beth Shalom, and tore it down, and they built a new world headquarters next to their existing world headquarters. And if you were at the EDC, the Economic Development Corporation in Kansas City, you will tell people they did it because of the subsidies. But I've spoken to a room full of urban, the Urban Land Institute, and we talked about this, and I said, does anybody here believe, and these are people who work for Burns and Mack and do this type of work for a living, does anybody here believe that they would not have done this without the subsidy? And not a hand went up. But they all know this is how the game is played. And Burns and Mack is not alone. I told you that TIF in Kansas City, there are fewer of them, but they tend to be larger. We have subsidized the world headquarters buildings for J.E. Dunn, which is a contracting firm, Burns and McDonnell, Cerner, which is the country's &1 recipient of tax credits. And they've gotten billions out of Kansas City and Missouri and the federal government. And H&R Block, which we talked about. And again, we've subsidized that entertainment district and luxury high-rises in downtown Kansas City, and our school district has 90% of kids on free and reduced lunch. So we are transferring money that should be going to poor school districts to wealthy corporations. And then this is the kicker. The people who work at the Kansas City Economic Development Council, I don't know about here in St. Louis, but the Economic Development Council in Kansas City is a 501c4. It is a lobbying organization. They staff the TIF Commission, and they are paid out of fees for TIF. So they have an internal conflict to say yes to everything. And I understand what they do is they don't necessarily say, will this be a good idea or a bad idea? They receive the application and make sure it complies with state and local law. So this is a proper application. Is it a good idea? Aren't they all good ideas? Maybe they'll say. And so then we decided, all right, how are we going to find this out? We've got the idea that political giving may contribute to how subsidies are handed out. So we went to the two biggest sources of information. First is the Department of Revenue's annual report on TIF, which I told you before is really just a compilation of what is given to them by the cities around the state. They don't, in fact, in one case we found an error. What the city sent them and what the state put in the report didn't match, and we haven't figured out how that happened. But they compile it, they don't audit the numbers, they understand the job numbers in here are self-reported and self-defined. And oftentimes if you go through and add up all the jobs that were promised in Missouri and all the jobs that they've self-reported, you get to maybe a third or a half of the promised jobs actually exist. So it's even when these guys make up numbers, they can't get to the numbers they promised. And then the other thing, of course, we went to the Missouri Ethics Commission and looked at political contributions between around, I think, 2000, 2017. And looked at all contributions over $1,000. Now, we immediately knew this was going to be frustrating because TIF is not necessarily received by Burns and Mack or another big developer. Oftentimes what they do is they set up an LLC specific to that project. The developer and their other partners kind of run that LLC, but it isn't immediately clear if this organization, which didn't exist 6 months ago, gets a TIF, who do we link the political contributions to, if any? So what we tried to do is say, all right, let's see who's standing behind the LLC, their principals, the people in the C-suite, maybe the company itself gave money, and then just recently, Susan Pendergrass, our director of development, suggested, well, maybe they're giving to PACs too. Forgive me, director of research, said maybe they're not making direct political contributions, maybe they're giving to PACs. So immediately we're like, oh my gosh, this research could go anywhere. But that's what we tried to do. And I told you these are some of the challenges, the LLCs, and then of course we all know there are plenty of ways that developers might reward politicians. It may not be in political contributions. Sometimes it's jobs for family members. And so we understand we're never going to get a full picture of it. And even then, TIF is a small part of economic development subsidies. There are Chapter 100s and 353 subsidies and abatement itself. So here's the work to be done. Identify and connect those LLCs receiving the TIF and the existing developers behind them. Separate out the giving that is unique to the TIF and try to divide out the background noise that we see, and identify other ways that developers may reward political behavior. And again, that may be tough to do. It is sometimes the case, I don't know how often this is, it is sometimes the case that a developer will say, we had this in Kansas City, our mayor was running for re-election, largely unopposed. I mean, he had 2 people against him, but he was unopposed. And so the money didn't go to his political campaign. It went to an unrelated PAC that he controls. And so we happened to find that out by accident, but money may not be flowing to the places that you would think. It may be going, giving money someplace else, and we just have to get our head around that. And that's kind of where we are right now. So I talked about in the last legislative session, the legislature took up some potential TIF reforms. We even had a hearing on it in the House. I was pleasantly surprised for that. And here are some things that may be a good idea. So the second and third one, limit the amount of TIF a city can give out in a year, or maybe cap what they have citywide. So in Kansas City, I think the amount of our aggregate property tax that is abated or that we don't collect is 14%, which seems really high to me. I don't know what the number should be, but 14% seems really high. I think within the library district it's even higher, like 19% of their value. And what I like about capping it, either at a percentage or at some amount, is if a city is limited to the amount of subsidy it can give out, the 2 big development attorneys in Kansas City will have to come and debate each other, right, and lobby against one another. And maybe that's a better way to kind of adjudicate a subsidy system, rather than have everybody come up one at a time and you just say yes to everyone. Something that was considered in the legislature was giving schools the opportunity. This is what Kansas does. The school can just say, hey, you guys can play with your money, but we're keeping the 62% or whatever it is that comes to us. We're just going to walk with this. Now, this changes behavior. It doesn't end TIF. It changes behavior. The developers now go to the school district and want to make them happy. But at least that's a little bit better, because the school district has the most to lose in TIF. We'll never, is Brenda here? We'll never fix government policy, but maybe we can make it better. We're still going to have guys that run around the system, and that's to be expected. But I think when we put the people who've got the skin in the game in charge of the decision making, that will make things better. Redefine blight. Georgia redefined blight to include infant mortality. And I thought that's really creative thinking. When they look at a blighted area, they look at poverty, they look at unemployment, and they look at infant mortality. I don't know if that's appropriate for Missouri, but I like that somebody was thinking, what does poverty mean? Is it really just the buildings? If poverty refers to the people, how do we measure it? Use third-party data for but-for determination. We kind of do that now, but what happens is these guys all work for the developer. The developer hires everybody, and there's a clear incentive to make the developer happy. I can talk more about that. And then it might be, right now, TIF, the language in the state law says that TIF can be used for up to 23 years, so you can give people back their property tax for up to 23 years, which means it almost always is 23 years. Libraries and school district folks I've spoken to have said, maybe if it were just 5 years or for 10 years. We understand. They're kind of believers in TIF. They just don't like the way it's been applied. I'm less inclined to allow TIF of any kind. But those guys say, we're not necessarily against it, but we'd wish maybe they didn't give away 100% of our property tax, maybe only 50 or 75%, and maybe they didn't give it away for 23 years. We'd be much happier with that. And by the way, in Kansas City, the Kansas City Public Library, and a few years ago the Mid-Continent Public Library sought to have their levy increased because they've been so drained of funds by TIF over the years that their budgets are flat. And so often this isn't just free money. The city diverts funds away from these taxing districts to give to developers, and the taxing district ends up coming back to the voter and say, can you increase your taxes? So here are some opportunities for reform. I am hopeful we will hear more about this. I think one of the big things I want to explain to legislators is that you guys may do a great job of keeping the state of Missouri at efficient levels of government, but the cities are running away with it. And so in Kansas City, and I'm sure in St. Louis, we have sales taxes in part of town that are higher than 10%. And in fact, there was an effort to cap the sales tax at 14% in Missouri, and the city of Kansas City and St. Louis were against it. And so my question is, what's too high? If 14 isn't too high, what would be too high? And of course, they don't want any cap at all. So thank you very much. At some point soon, we'll be releasing the full study when we when we collect all the data and say, well, here's how we're going to look at it, and that will be made available to everybody. But in the meantime, I welcome any questions or even any thoughts on how we might go about this. In past sessions, I've had developers come up after me, and they're not usually happy with the attitude I take on TIF, but they'll give me some good insight on what to look for. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Yes, sir. I think cities need to do a better job of clawback. I would love to see a definition of a full-time employee that is meaningful. I think they could do that. And again, it's not, I always want to make this clear. It's not that myself or the Show Me Institute or any of these researchers are against development. We love it when somebody comes in and puts their own money on the line. But if they're going to ask for public subsidies, we just want to make sure we're getting our money's worth. I describe it as getting a St. Valentine's Day card from your mother. You open the mailbox and you see the red card and you're like, oh, somebody thought of me, right? And then you open it and you see it's from your mom, like, it doesn't count. Right? So you see all this development downtown, you're like, this is exciting. Somebody wants to build a hotel in downtown Kansas City. And then you realize, oh, the taxpayers are paying for it, it doesn't count. But I would welcome any of them. The best thing about TIF is almost any reform would make it better than what we have now. Yes, sir. Certainly in St. Louis, where you have all these tiny municipalities that war with each other, the University City TIF is a great example. They're going to bulldoze people's family businesses to build a Costco because they want people spending money on this side of the street, not the other side of the street. It's even bigger because what Kansas City will tell you is, well, we can't have statewide reforms because we're warring with Kansas. And so if we lay down our weapons, they'll just run away with it. Now, of course, the research says let them run away with it. They're wasting their money too. But politicians have this, we've got to do something. We've got to throw money at somebody. So certainly it's true. I'll tell you what is heartbreaking. I did a paper on the TIF down in Joplin, and I went to visit some members of the city council in Mount Vernon between Joplin and Springfield. And these people, and they're not unique, are deathly afraid that their town is going to dry up and blow away. Their kids are graduating from high school, they're going off to school, they're leaving, and they're afraid they're not coming back. So Walmart comes along and shows a little bit of leg and says, hey, I'll put this here, I'll create jobs. Now Walmart maybe doesn't care where along this 10-mile stretch they put their store, but they have towns all along that 10-mile stretch falling all over themselves, and it's tragic because they don't have they take the developers at their word. And what happened, Raytown is a perfect example. So Raytown is a suburb of Kansas City. They built a Walmart, they pay no property tax, they pay very little sales tax, or they get it all, give it back to them. Walmart is the #1 source of police calls in Raytown. They are a huge drain on the police of the city of Raytown, yet they pay none of the property taxes that go to support the police. But Raytown was desperate for an economic engine. Yeah, so thank you for asking that, because I think in principle, even though I'm a never TIFer, I think you can go back to that original claim of need. So here's what you might do. First of all, rather than letting developers come to you with their project, you just identify on the map, we're going to have, if we do any kind of economic development subsidies, it's going to be in this area. So already you limit where the ideas are going to happen. I laugh because I was talking about TIF, and one of the people who's a supporter of the system said, well, I said, why don't you TIF in the parts of town that are needy? And they're like, well, we can't make it work. I'm like, that's why we're giving you subsidies, But unfortunately, in Kansas City, they put it in the nice parts of town. The second thing I would do is, rather than a cash outlay, because our economic development director in Kansas City said, I don't know if he meant this to be an aside or meant this to be public, but I heard him say it. He said, listen, the reason why we have to offer TIF is because our Kansas City is so unwelcoming to new development, right? There are all sorts of rules and contracts which drive up costs, that they come to us and say, look, if we're going to build in your city and deal with all this regulation, we want some money. Well, maybe what we do is we have a TIF that says, look, if you're willing to build here, we'll get all this red tape out of your way. At the federal level, and I don't know more about this than to just mention it, but at the federal level, the recent tax program created something called opportunity zones, which are intending to encourage a lot of development in areas that need it. That might be promising, but my fear is if we have the same structure to implement it that we have now, we're going to miss a lot of opportunities. But I think you start off by saying, don't come to us unless you're going to develop in this area. And what we're going to do is clear regulation and red tape out of your way rather than just shovel money at you. And then I'd like to see clawbacks. I'd like to see some real measurement of what is it you're creating, like full-time employees. And I'd like to say, just if you're not meeting this, we want our money back. So the city could simply, in its contract with the developer, say, here are the metrics we're going to use. You say you're going to create 2,200 jobs. Okay, so maybe we want a creation of jobs in the construction, right? And by the way, construction doesn't create jobs like we think it does. It creates more projects for people who already have jobs. But so maybe we want something there. But then once you move in, we want to see your books as a company. We want to know that you have moved from X amount of employees, full-time employees, to X plus something. And we're going to check that every year. And we are not going to release those TIF funds, the property tax, to you until we are satisfied that you are hiring this many people. I think it's good jobs first, again, kind of a left of center group. They say not only do we want to make sure you're hiring those many people, we want to make sure they have good benefits and have good salaries, and that maybe you've got diversity hiring practices, all this stuff. And I say, look, you take the king's money, you're going to dance to the king's tune. If you want subsidies, I think it's perfectly appropriate for the jurisdiction giving them to you to say, we want you to abide by this. But I'd love to see that. I don't know what that might look like, but we've got none of it now. So they say we create 2,000 jobs, they don't. Everyone's fine with it.
I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.